Welcome to Unit 7 on Chapter 13 on Inventory Management. This is a very important chapter in our semester to understand operations management. We will be taking our time going through this chapter. There are multiple parts of the lecture. Make sure that you view all of them. Also, at the end of this chapter, there will be an assessment quiz that each of you will take. They will count 10% toward your grade, and it will be my responsibility to prepare you to take that assessment quiz. So make sure that you do view all parts of the lecture, and also make sure that you also do the homework assignment that is associated with this chapter. These are the learning objectives for inventory management. You can see there's quite a few. You may want to pause the lecture at this point and look through the objectives, and then when you're finished, go back and begin the rest of the lecture. So we need to define what inventory is. An inventory is an item of stock or some type of store of good. So if I am a manufacturing company, I need to keep inventories in some type of location. The demand for these inventories quite often are referenced as independent demand, but there could be exceptions to that. Now, we want to make sure that we manage our inventories correctly. For a manufacturing company, if they cannot manage their inventories in a proper way, then it's very difficult for them to be successful. So as this slide shows, that a typical company could have roughly 30% of their assets tied up in inventory. So there are different types of inventory, and we'll talk briefly about them in this slide. So one type of inventory that we would have is inventory for raw materials and purchased parts. We could also throw in another word in this type of inventory. The other word would be a component. So raw materials, purchased parts, or components. So examples of this type of inventory, if we take into consideration like a smartphone, a raw material or purchased part would be the display, the glass display that's part of a phone. Another type of inventory is work in progress, or sometimes referred to as WIP. So work in progress is taking our raw materials and purchased parts and beginning the process of converting those or transforming those to some finished product. So we have started work on the finished product, but we're not quite finished yet. So while we're in this in-process state, we refer to that type of inventory as WIP. Finished goods inventories represent the inventory of the item that we sell to our customers. So an example of a smartphone, that would be the finished smartphone itself. So those three types are the primary types of inventories that manufacturing companies deal with, but there are a few others. So we could have inventories of certain tools or supplies that are needed to take our raw materials and convert them to our finished product. Those tools and those supplies are very important, so we have to keep track of how many of those that we have as well. MRO inventory, maintenance and repair inventory, again, are inventory items that are not necessarily part of the finished product, but we need these in order to actually perform the transformation process. So any cleaning materials or things of that nature would be example of MRO inventory. And then finally, the movement of finished products from one location to another. So we've already talked about supply chains. So the movement of inventories from one company in the supply chain to another company is also an example of inventories. So what we're trying to do in inventory control is trying to achieve a proper level of customer service. Now, one of the things that your customer is going to want to have is when they're ready to purchase something, for the most part, they're wanting you to have that item available to them whenever they're ready to purchase. So having the right item, the right good, in the right quantity at the right place is a measure of customer service. But there is some costs associated with doing that. And the two primary costs that we'll study in this chapter is the cost of ordering materials if we're buying something from someone else, and then also the cost of carrying that inventory as well. So from an operations management point of view, what we're trying to do is achieve a very delicate balancing act of having the right amount of inventory while at the same time keeping our costs under control. So we need to have some way of measuring how well we're doing in this regard. One measure of inventory performance is how well we're doing is shown at the bottom of this slide, and that is the measure we refer to as inventory turnover. So that's a very common measurement, very easily calculated from the financial statements, and the higher the inventory turnover ratio is what that is, then the better we are doing in our goal for inventory management. So our inventory management, what we're trying to do is basically make some decisions regarding inventory. We need to identify what we need to order or make, when we need to order or make them. So when is a timing issue, it's a date issue. How much we need to order or make. So that is a quantitative value, a number, how much to make. And then finally, when things should be finished or when they should arrive. Inventory management tends to be a very policy-oriented thing. So when I use the word policy, another word that I could use instead of that is a rule. So it is a rule-based environment. So I have certain items of inventory that I manage using certain rules or certain policies, and other items I manage with different rules or policies. And the two major factors that influence which rule or policy that I use one is the type of inventory that it is. Is it a raw material or component, or is it a finished product? And another one is the overall importance of that item. So all inventory items do not have the same importance. I will talk about how to identify the important ones from the less important ones in later sections of this chapter. So an overall good, effective inventory management system is going to have the elements shown in this slide. So the first item on the list is a system. So the word system is going to usually be interpreted to mean a computer system, since we live in the age of computers, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a computer system. So some way of keeping track of inventory, of knowing how much we have. Now that might sound like a simple statement, but I'm here to tell you that that is a very difficult thing to do, of knowing how many that you have. And there are many reasons that makes it a difficult thing to do. But the primary reason is that inventory is handled so much and so often by so many different people that the opportunity for making a mistake in recording our inventories is very great. So when we have a lot of opportunity to make mistakes, then that increases the chance of a mistake taking place. In many companies, the inventory tracking of what they theoretically have compared to what they actually have is about 50%. In other words, 50% of their items of inventory, what they actually have and what their computer or their paper system tells them they do have is incorrect. 50% are incorrect. We also need some way of predicting demand. So again, in inventory management, quite often we're very dependent upon having an accurate demand. We need to know what our lead times are. So how long does it take to acquire or to purchase this part from an outside company? And then also some idea of the variability of that lead time. So we know that variability will always exist, and in lead times, there's no exception. There will be variability on that lead time. We also need to have some reasonable estimates regarding several cost categories here: holding costs, ordering costs, and shortage costs. And we'll talk more about what the definition are of those costs in just a minute here. And then finally, some way of being able to classify our inventory items, being able to identify which are the most important and which are the least important. Now, there's at least two different ways in which we can keep track of our inventory. These are referred to as inventory counting system. One method is the periodic system, in which we go out and we physically count every item of inventory at some periodic interval, maybe once a year, maybe twice a year, maybe 4 times a year. And we then take that count and we update our inventory records and say this is what we have. Periodic inventory systems are notoriously bad in that the physical process of counting things is not an easy step. If I had 100 pennies and I asked several students to count how many pennies that I had, I doubt if all of them would come up with exactly 100 pennies. So counting is very error prone. So the periodic system, whereas it may help in some cases, in other cases it introduces error that was not there to begin with. The more common way is with a perpetual inventory system. In this, we have a computer system that is going to keep track every time an item is placed into inventory. The inventory balance will rise, and every time an item is removed from inventory, the inventory balance will decrease. But even with a perpetual inventory system, as I said earlier, this is also very prone for error. So if someone forgets to put in to the computer system that we took out so many, then that information is going to distort what the actual balance is. Now, the simplest of our inventory management systems or our replenishment planning systems that we could think about is shown in this slide, and this is referred to as the 2-bin system. Now, the 2-bin system has been around for a long time. It's actually a very simple, very effective way of managing the inventory of an item. So here's how the 2-bin system works. I have 2 containers, one marked bin 1 or container 1, the other bin 2 or container 2. They have exactly the same material in them, and they have exactly the same quantity of material in them. So when I need some of this inventory, I'm going to start pulling from, let's say, bin 1, and I will continue to pull from bin 1 until bin 1 is completely empty. When bin 1 becomes completely empty, then I will do two things. First thing I will do is order a replenishment of that inventory from wherever I get it. And the second thing is any further demand for this item will then begin starting with bin 2. So by the time that I have finished emptying bin 2, my resupply of inventory that I had ordered previously has arrived, and now I have filled bin 1 back up. When bin 2 is empty, I go through the same thing. I'm going to order some more, and then I start pulling from bin 1 again. So the two-bin system is the simplest method of managing inventory. It's quite effective. It doesn't really require a computer system to do. So two pieces of information that we need in our planning of inventory. One is some type of forecast for demand for our finished product. Another way of keeping track of demand is through a point of sale system. So generally today, in most retail stores, the cash register that you use is also a computer terminal. And as items are passed across the barcode reader, the information on that particular item is recorded into computer files, so we know that the demand occurred for that item. We sold it. We also are going to decrease the inventory for that item because we know that it was sold to a customer. The last thing we could do is we could possibly share that information, that point of sale data, with the company that we buy that from, and that would help them in understanding what the demand is for that item. The second is the lead time. So how long does it take between the time that I order an item and it actually is received back in my building? So there are several different types of costs associated with inventory. Let's talk about them. The first is the purchase cost. So this is the amount that I actually pay for buying something from an outside company. Now, the purchase cost is actually, as we start to get into our inventory management models, there's only one of our inventory management models that's going to use the purchase cost. In fact, the other models actually do not use the purchase cost. The next cost we'll talk about is the holding or the carrying cost. The holding or the carrying cost is the cost associated with once I have purchased an item and I'm going to keep that item for some length of time, how long did it cost me to keep that item for some length of time? And the length of time that we usually associate in this particular cost category is 1 year. So the elements that would go into holding or carrying costs would be things such as the cost of the warehouse where I keep the material, and the labor cost of the employees that work in the warehouse. In addition to that cost, there is certain insurance that must be carried on that inventory. So if something were to happen to the warehouse, if it were to burn down or something like that, we need to protect our investment by carrying insurance. That's a cost that will be included in here. There's certain obsolescence or theft or something, inventory somehow gets damaged or misplaced or even stolen. And that particular cost is also a component of this holding or carrying cost. Now, there are two different ways of defining inventory carrying or holding cost. And this is important, so please listen carefully. One method is to state the inventory carrying cost as a flat dollar rate. For example, This particular inventory item has a inventory carrying cost of $1.20 per year. What that means is for that one item, if I kept it in inventory for 1 year, it would cost me $1.20. The second method of defining holding costs is as a percentage of price, a percentage of price. So an example for that is, let's say I have an item that I buy and its price is $4. And the inventory carrying cost for this item is defined to be 30% of price. So whenever I see a problem that states the inventory carrying cost is a percent of price, all I'm going to do is to multiply the percentage times the price and end up with a flat rate. So 30% of $4 is $1.20. So you can see that I'm getting exactly the same thing as I get with the flat rate. So some of your homework problems and on your assessment quiz, you have to look at which way the holding cost is defined. And if it's defined as a percentage of price, just multiply the percent times the price. Another cost category in inventory management is the ordering cost. The ordering cost is defined to be the cost associated with ordering the inventory item and receiving the inventory item. So ordering the inventory item would include, those costs would include the cost of the purchasing department. So I have people that work in my purchasing or procurement department. They have salaries and benefits. There is a computer system that they use. What is the cost associated with that computer system that they must use for ordering the materials? And then whenever the materials are received, those employees that are part of the receiving dock. Now these are different employees that are not part of the warehouse. They're part of the receiving dock. So what is that cost of receiving the item into the warehouse? Two more inventory costs, setup costs. So the definition of a setup cost is the cost associated with setting up a piece of equipment. So setup is the process of preparing the equipment to do work, of just preparing the equipment to do work. So there could be some type of time and labor involved in doing that. And finally, the last inventory cost category is referred to as a shortage cost. So what does it cost the company if we have a customer who wishes to buy something, but we don't have that item in inventory? Shortage costs, or we could also refer to this as opportunity cost, is something that's very difficult to quantify. It's very difficult to really come up with a very specific cost associated with that. It's reasonable to expect that it is going to have a cost impact on the company, but quite often it's very difficult to quantify. So one of the elements of an effective inventory control system is a classification system. So in classifying our inventories, the standard technique for doing that is referred to as an ABC classification system. So the ABC classification system is a practical application of what we have studied earlier in this semester as the Pareto principle. So we know that Pareto was an Italian economist who studied the distribution of wealth in Italy, and after his studies were completed, he concluded that a very small percentage of the population had a very significant amount of the wealth in the country. And there was a very, very large percent of the population that had very little wealth. Well, applying that to inventory, the inventory items that are the most important we refer to as the A items. So typically the A items of inventory are very small in number, maybe 10 to 20% of the total number of inventory items in your warehouse, but they represent a fairly significant amount of your investment in inventory, maybe upwards of 60 to 70%. They are the most important. The C items, on the other hand, are the least important. So the C items could be anywhere from 50 to 60% in number of all inventory items, but from a financial point of view, they only represent 10 to 15% of our total investment in inventory. And of course, the B items are somewhere in between the A and the C. So they are not the most important, they're not the least important, they are somewhere in the middle. Now, we'll begin our case study. And this is a case study that I have developed. You will not find this in your textbook. There's also a Word document that is available to you through the learning management system that also has the case study. But I've also built it into the lecture here. So the example has to do with ZZ's Pizza near UTD. Now, you know where that is, down the road on Campbell. And except it's not ZZ's, there's another name for it that sounds similar to ZZ's, but it's not ZZ's. And let's pretend that you are the manager of this pizza restaurant. And one of your responsibilities is to manage inventories of this. So what we're going to be doing is applying some of the things that you as manager of this restaurant will need to do with inventory management as we go through this chapter. So one of the things that you're required to do in the manager role is to come up with a ABC classification of some of your inventory items. So what we see on this slide is a number of inventory items, starting with mozzarella cheese and going over to lettuce. And we have a good estimate of what the annual demand is for each of those. So all the values in the annual demand row are in pounds. So we have used 1,500 pounds of mozzarella cheese and so forth. And then the third row is the price associated with each of those items. Okay, let's do an ABC classification for our ZZ items. And what I'm showing you now is a procedure for doing the ABC classification. This is not from your textbook. This is something that I built in. And then there's also a spreadsheet which we'll be switching to, and we'll be performing the steps in the spreadsheet. And the spreadsheet, as well as this Word document, are part of your materials on the learning management system. So the first step in the procedure is to calculate the dollar investment of that particular item by multiplying the price by the annual demand. And then after I've done that, then I need to sort all the items in descending order so that I finish up with the item that I have the highest inventory investment in at the top of the list, and then the lowest one, the smallest one at the bottom of the list. And step number 3 is just to add up our annual dollar investment for each item so I know what the total annual dollar investment is for all the inventory items. So I'm going to do steps 1, 2, and 3 on the spreadsheet. So here I have the items of inventory that we want to classify, the annual demand, and the price. So I'm going to calculate what the annual cost is for each item very simply by putting in a formula. And multiply the demand times the price. I can then copy that formula down to all the items. The next step is to sort this list in descending order on the annual cost. So I can highlight the items, go to a sort, and sort on the annual cost from largest to smallest. So now I can see that crust is my highest inventory item. So by definition, that will be an A item. Mushrooms is my lowest investment, and by definition, that's going to be a C item. And we need to go through the rest of the procedures to determine what the others are. And then the next step 3 is then to determine what the total cost is for all these items. So I can do a very quick auto sum here to add up the cost of all the items, and I can see that my total annual investment for all the items is shown here. Let's go back to the procedure and see what we need to do next. So now we are at step number 4, and step number 4 says to calculate the percentage of each item's investment to the total investment. Okay, so let's do that. So step number 4, crust, we have an annual investment of $580. So as a percentage, what is it compared to our total of $2,405? So the formula that I'm going to put in here is going to need to use something that we refer to as absolute cell referencing. So in order to make sure that I'm always dividing this item by the total demand, if I hit the F4 function key after I click on the total, that is going to insert a $sign in front of the row and the column. And when I copy that cell all the way down, that will ensure that I'm always dividing by the. I need to convert that to a percentage, which I'm going to do. So now that is a percent. So 24% of my annual inventory is invested in this one item of crust. And now I'm going to copy that formula all the way down, and I can see what the percentage is for the others. So once again, if you're using Excel, when you get to this step, you need to make sure that you have a $sign in front of the row and also a $sign in front of the column when you put in your formula. Let's see what the next step in the procedure is. So now we are at step number 5. And step number 5 says to calculate the cumulative investment for each item's percent of total investment. So let's go and take a look at this. So the first item we know is the biggest one. So from a cumulative percent, it is 24%. Now, for the first 2 items, the crust and the pepperoni, I need to add together the percentage of each one. I can put in a formula that will calculate it. So for the first 2 items, for crust and pepperoni, they represent a total of 44% of my total inventory investment. Now I can copy that formula down. So now I know for each item what the total investment is for that item as well as all the items above it. So the last step. The last step in the procedure, step number 6, is to assign the ABC classification for each individual item. So the A items are those items whose cumulative percent is around 60%, but it doesn't necessarily have to be 60%. The B items are those items that fall somewhere between 60 to maybe 90%, and then all the rest of the items by definition will be the C items. So let's go ahead and do that. So the ABC classification. So by definition, the first item is going to be an A item. And the second item, its cumulative is 44%. So we're looking for about 60% as our cutoff. Now the third item, the mozzarella cheese, its cumulative percent is 63%. Now students, this is not a precise science, and there's a certain amount of judgment involved. I'm going to call that an A item. So the first 3 items are the A items. Now the next one, I'm definitely above the 60%, so that's going to be a B item. The next one is going to be a B item. And now the last 2, I'm over 90% now, so by definition, they're going to be my C items. Now the ratio of the number of A items to the total is not going to follow the true nature of ABC classification because we only have just a few items here, about 6 or 7 items. But in a real-world situation where we're talking about thousands and thousands of inventory items, that the A items are going to be small in number, maybe 10 to 15% of the total number of items, but their representation of the total investment is going to be quite large. So this is an example of how to do an ABC analysis. I've given you a procedure. I've demonstrated that procedure. You will have a homework problem where you will need to do this, so make sure that you understand how to do it for your homework problem. Now, the ABC classification system, again, the A items are the most important. The B items are the least important. The C items are the least important. The B items are somewhere in between. So one of the requirements for an effective inventory control system is a system for keeping track of inventory. And we talked about the periodic system and the perpetual system, but there's another method that is much better, and that's called cycle counting. Cycle counting is a technique for counting a few items of inventory every day, counting a few items of inventory every day. So if I'm only going to count the inventory of several items, then that really improves my opportunity for getting it correct. It's only when I'm trying to count everything that I get overwhelmed that I start making mistakes. So cycle counting is a very effective way of checking your inventory balance to see if it is correct. So for any A items that I'm counting on any particular day, because they are very important, the accuracy of those inventory items needs to be very small, such as shown in this slide. They have to be accurate within 0.2%. The C items, since they are less important, the accuracy of those is not quite as important. So the accuracy of those could be plus or minus 5%. And again, the B is somewhere in the middle, and so the accuracy of the B items could be 1% or something such as that. So this concludes part A of our chapter on inventory management.